Hello everybody and welcome to another Fire Emblem video here on the channel. Today we're going to be talking about something that's fairly personal to me, at least in the context of Fire Emblem, and that is Iron Mans. So I love playing Fire Emblem using Iron Man rules. If you've ever watched any of my streams or any gameplay here on the channel, you probably know this very well because basically all of it is using Iron Man rules. I believe that Iron Mans can give sort of an emotional and strategic investment in the Fire Emblem games that can't really be found otherwise, or at least not to the extent that Iron Mans can provide, and I want to use my own personal experience to explain what I mean by that. My desire here is to get people to think about how they can enjoy Fire Emblem more, and I believe that an Iron Man is a great way to do that. It's honestly, and this is genuine, what rekindled my love for Fire Emblem, and really the reason that I make content regarding Fire Emblem, because I just love it, and it really never gets old, at least to me. Obviously, everyone should enjoy Fire Emblem however they see fit. This isn't to force anyone into anything. This is just, again, my own personal experience and why I think you should at least give Iron Man potentially a shot, especially if you find, especially sort of replaying a lot of the older games a little boring, but we'll talk about that more later. So we're going to be talking about two different things in this video. Number one, I'm just going to give a brief description of sort of the Iron Man rules, some rules that I think you should follow, some rules that you potentially don't need to, things like that. And then we're going to be talking about why I think you should try it. And again, I'm going to be using my own personal experience to explain that. The last thing I want to mention before we start the actual video is the footage that you're going to be seeing. These are mostly just clips from my various Iron Mans. I wasn't really sure what to put in the background here, so this is basically just going to be sort of fun moments, more brutal moments. If these seem like fun moments to you, perhaps you want to Iron Man, because I think that, again, I mentioned emotional responses earlier, emotional investment. I think you only really get this kind of stuff if you Iron Man. At least that's been my experience. So again, we'll talk about that more later. But yeah, I'll also leave a link to the in the description to my sort of big clip compilation that I did. If you want to see all these clips and more from all of my runs throughout the history of my channel, feel free to click on that down below. I think it's pretty entertaining. But yeah, we'll get right into the video. All right, so before we get to why you should Iron Man, I want to talk about what an Iron Man is. So there's basically one really important rule to Iron Mans that you basically have to follow, because otherwise you're not really Iron Manning, and that is you basically can't reset a chapter. This is really important for unit deaths and specifically Lord deaths. Basically, if a unit dies, you can't reset a chapter to essentially bring them back and redo the chapter. And if a Lord dies, it's a game over. Now, there are other reasons that you can't reset a chapter for, things like forgetting to bring a unit to recruit an enemy, or failing to get side objectives. These ones are a little bit more up to you as far as like whether or not you want to abide by them. Again, it's really important that you don't reset chapters for character deaths, because again, then you're not really Iron Manning. But there are situations where like you just forgot to bring a certain item, or you forgot to bring a character that you need to recruit somebody, and you just want a quick reset. It's up to you. I tend to just say no resets, period. So if I forget a character, then that's on me. But this one, again, it can be a little bit up to your own interpretation on that stuff. But the unit deaths and the Lord deaths are really important to follow. Iron Mans are sort of similar to Nuzlockes in Pokemon. The idea of those is if a Pokemon dies, you release them, they're dead forever. So if you want to think about it in those terms, because I know those are a little bit more popular, that's a good way to look at it. And honestly, a lot of the reasons that people really enjoy Nuzlockes are going to be very similar to the reasons that people enjoy Iron Mans in Fire Emblem. So if you enjoy Nuzlockes, you may like yourself an Iron Man. But that's the big rule, the big tenet. You have to make sure not to reset chapters for those sorts of reasons. This can actually be a really good way to sort of figure out whether or not you're comfortable doing Iron Mans when sort of your first like unit or that you really like or Lord dies, whether or not you're willing to not reset that chapter or reset the entire game. So you may, if you try an Iron Man, you may figure out very quickly if they're for you. There's three other rules that I want to talk about that are, again, more up to your own interpretation or up to your own like, you know, you can either leave them or implement them in your games. The first one is playing on the hardest difficulty in whatever game you're playing. This one is not necessary, and in fact, if you're just starting Iron Manning, especially for games like, you know, FE7 or FE6, it might even be very advantageous to you to not play on the hardest difficulty. But at some point, I think you're going to get the most out of your Iron Mans by playing on the hardest difficulty for whatever game you're playing. But again, you certainly don't have to start with that, and you never have to get to the hardest difficulty if you don't feel comfortable with that. The second one, and this one I would recommend following, is no grinding in arenas or in the overworld. So like the arenas in, let's say, the GBA games, also games like Thracia have arenas. You don't just go and get like every character to level 20 right off the bat. And also in games like Sacred Stones or Awakening, you don't go grind these sort of overworld mobs. Or like in Tower of Elnai, for example, to again get everyone to level 20. I think this just sort of ruins a lot of the fun of the game and makes your units really overpowered. Again, if you need to do like a little bit of grinding, or even if you do want to get characters level 20, that is up to you. But again, I think it ruins a little bit of the fun to do stuff like that. And the final thing is turtling. So turtling is really up to your own interpretation as far as like what it is. Basically, the idea of turtling is that you put all of your units in sort of one big group, one big conglomerate, and you just work through a chapter very slowly, destroying everything in your path. It is arguably the most effective way to get through basically every chapter, and if you need to turtle some of the time, that's totally fine. I wind up turtling a decent amount of the time. I think basically everyone that Iron Man's at some point does. You're not trying to like LTLC or finish chapters super quick or anything, but it may be more fun for you to try to complete chapters in a timely manner, because otherwise it can get a little bit bogged down with just, again, destroying everything in your path very slowly. So again, you can do these 3 rules or not. It is completely up to you. There are also other rules that you could implement, or other rules that I'm just forgetting about right now. The most important thing is, again, just don't reset chapters, at least for unit deaths or lord deaths. Those are the important things. So I just want to mention like why you might want to do this. The biggest things in a Fire Emblem Iron Man, and again I mentioned a Pokemon Nuzlocke, the biggest sort of advantages of doing them, at least in my opinion, is there is a big increase in the strategy that's required to succeed, and you wind up caring a lot more about your units and the actual game itself when you do this stuff. And we're going to talk about those 2 things in particular a lot more in the next section, and again I'll talk about my own personal experience. Okay, so with all that out of the way, I want to talk about what I think is probably the most important part about this video, at least to me, which is using my own personal experience to talk about why I think people should Iron Man, and why I sort of rekindled my love, especially for the older games, by starting to Iron Man. So if you've ever seen any of the gameplay here on the channel, or anything from my Twitch stream, which is basically all Iron Mans on the hardest difficulty, it would probably surprise you to know that for most of my Fire Emblem sort of life, from when I started playing, a decade plus ago, to even a few years ago, I would play about as casually as anyone could, really. I would always play in the easiest difficulty. I would always arena grind or Tower of Elnai grind, whatever. I didn't really care as much for the sort of strategic elements of the game. I just wanted to see my units get as strong as they could. I just really like the units, and I really like the stats. And this is a totally fine way to play and experience Fire Emblem. But coming from someone that was so casual, again, it may surprise you to know, considering how sort of hardcore Iron Man I've become. And I want to explain, again, sort of why I got to that point, and why maybe you can get to that point, even if you are playing it on sort of easier difficulties and things like that. So there's 2 really important things I think that Iron Man's provided me with, and we're going to talk about those next. So the first thing that I want to talk about is basically getting to, or having to, I guess you could say, relearn a lot of older Fire Emblem games, even games that you're really familiar with, in a whole new way. So it's basically required to play on harder difficulties, and especially on Iron Mans, to learn different strats and stuff. So, I mentioned earlier that I played very casually on the easiest difficulties for a long time. And at some point, my old favorites like Fire Emblem 7, I realized that I hadn't gone back and actually played through a lot of these games in a long time. And while Fire Emblem, I've always considered it my favorite game, at the time I was sort of like, maybe I am done with Fire Emblem, especially these older ones. I didn't feel a reason to go back and play them. It just didn't feel replayable to me. I'd had so many playthroughs that had trained all the different units and seen them all get to level 20. I'd completely exhausted everything that at least I thought that I could do in those games. And a big part of that was that I had just played the game so much. So if you've only played, something like Fire Emblem 7 a couple times, there may still be reasons to go back and play. But at least for me, I'd pretty much been burned out, especially of my old favorites. And I mentioned Fire Emblem 7 here in particular. This goes for a lot of games, but Fire Emblem 7 was the first game that I learned to Iron Man. Now, I'm just going to mention this before I move on. I would not recommend starting with Fire Emblem 7. I would recommend starting with something like maybe Fire Emblem 8, Sacred Stones. But Fire Emblem 7 is where I started for some reason. I always just had this like weird fascination with Hector hard mode because I thought it was so insane. At the time I just could not fathom beating Hector hard mode like at all. Let alone in a Fire Emblem capacity. I'd only completed it like using save states and grinding units early in the arena and stuff like that. Iron Manning Hector hard mode just seemed like insane and extremely pointless. But as I started to learn the game and actually invest myself in the Iron Man, and get like a lot of game overs, which to be fair is just going to be a part of any Iron Man, especially when you're learning it. It's part of the fun. Again, there's a lot of sort of indicators I'll say when you play Iron Mans. What happens when your first favorite character dies? What happens when you get your 6th game over on chapter 4 or whatever? How do you react to that? And that's going to really tell you whether or not I think you're going to enjoy Iron Mans. I personally, I loved it. As frustrating as it was, I just couldn't stop trying to use different strategies and learn the game and move forward. So this was huge for me in, again, rekindling my love of a lot of these older games. And I know that I mentioned rekindling my love earlier, and genuinely, it did rekindle my love for these older games, and it could do that for you if you've sort of become jaded or bored with a lot of these older Fire Emblem games. And this was the case with like all the Fire Emblem games that I've ever tried to learn in an Iron Man capacity. I really had no reason or very little reason to go back and learn a lot of these older games, even the ones that I really loved. But this whole new challenge that opened up for me really forced me to go back and relearn. And even after I've completed, runs of these games like Fire Emblem 6, Fire Emblem 7, all these different games many, many times, I'm still excited to go back and play them because Iron Man's are just so unique. Every single one is so different that I just love it. And there's other stipulations that you can do. Like recently I've been doing low tier runs of the GBA games, so I only use like characters that I think are kind of mediocre to bad. So you can even push the boundaries if you've even become a little bit too used to the games, or you feel like they're too easy. So again, if you're somebody who's gotten bored of just moving really strong characters from one side of the map to the other with no real concern for the consequences, an Iron Man can be a great way to rekindle your love for Fire Emblem. And if you're playing games like Hector Hard Mode or Fire Emblem 6, if you think the hard modes of these games are too difficult and frustrating, it's 100% fine to play on lower difficulties. I know I mentioned this earlier that I think you should eventually play on the hardest difficulty, but you certainly don't have to. If you need to start with lower difficulties, absolutely feel free. It may very well help with your frustration. You may never want to get up to the hardest difficulty. That's totally fine. Just having the Iron Man there, just having the idea that like if this character dies, it genuinely means something, is enough. You don't need to be on like the hardest difficulty necessarily. I will say, and this is going to be sort of counterintuitive to what I just said, I would recommend trying games on the hardest difficulty, just not necessarily in an Iron Man capacity. I know that's kind of not what I'm talking about here, but I think even just playing on harder difficulties can achieve a lot of these same results. It forces you to come up with strategies. It forces you to be a little bit more invested in the characters and the chapters, but it doesn't have that frustration that the Iron Mans can have. So if you are trying Iron Mans and you do find them very frustrating, I would still recommend trying games on hard mode. I really do think that it helped, again, to rekindle my love and can help you out. But Iron Mans may not be the way to go. So just be aware of that. And the second thing that I want to talk about that's so great, at least I think so great about Iron Mans, is a combination of the sort of tension that you get from every chapter and even every turn potentially being the last for a unit that you really like or your entire run, which I think keeps things really fresh and exciting. And that's sort of mixed with the accomplishment of actually completing a run, which I think is can't really be understated. Like when you play Fire Emblem normally and you're not going to reset when your lord dies, it's basically a formality that you will complete the game. And while there's nothing wrong with that, you can still get a lot of a feeling of accomplishment playing the game in that capacity. When you play an Iron Man, it was not a formality that you'd complete the game. You're not guaranteed to complete that playthrough. It's on you that you kept your lord alive for those 28, 24, whatever chapters. So I think there's a lot more accomplishment that comes from Iron Mans because you're investing in permadeath, essentially. And I want to talk about permadeath a little bit, because it is something that's fairly exclusive to the Fire Emblem franchise. It's built into the game. People love Nuzlocke, I mentioned that earlier, which essentially, like, adds permadeath to Pokemon, but permadeath is already a thing in Fire Emblem. And it is really brutal and it is really frustrating to lose your unit, but it is also really important in getting the players to invest both strategically and emotionally in their playthroughs. At least I believe. Now, I'm not saying that this is like the correct way to play. You don't have to play like the designers intended for sure. But again, I think you get a lot more emotional and strategic investment if you play with these permadeath options sort of on, so to speak. Which again is already sort of intentional in Fire Emblem, and Fire Emblem is already pretty well set up to help you out with permadeath stuff. Obviously, if your lord dies, you don't get another lord, but a lot of these games do give you multiple units that you can fall back on, and that's part of why I think Fire Emblem Iron Mans are so much fun to play. It's part of why I love randomizers in Pokemon, because every Iron Man is going to be different. There are going to be, potentially Iron Mans that are similar where you just use the strongest units, but a lot of times units are going to die for you, and you're going to be forced into that, third tier unit that you don't really like that much, but maybe they're going to be the MVP of your playthrough. That's another beauty of going back and continuously replaying these games, is like, unlike a game like Pokemon, I'm not trying to shit on Pokemon, I really like Pokemon, but unlike a game like Pokemon where, Pokemon are always going to have the same stats at level 50, depending on, EVs and IVs, in Fire Emblem, you really don't know. You could have a level 20 unit in one game be dramatically different from a level 20 unit in another game. And there could be units that you again, you think are like F tier units suddenly be the MVPs of your playthrough. And that's really fun. You don't necessarily get that that sense of accomplishment and that sense of being forced into, certain units if you're playing the game normally. Now, that is also frustrating because you might not get to use the unit that you really wanted to use because they died. But it really does help to make each playthrough feel unique, at least in my experience. If you want to experience, the lows of the lows in Fire Emblem, when, let's say, like, your mage dies to like a sub 20% accent, which I'm 100% speaking from experience here, from like an ambush spawn in Fire Emblem 6, let's say, the Iron Man is the way to do it, and those things matter. They very much matter. You're going to be on the edge of your seat when that brigand is in the air about to hit or miss your mage with that 16% or whatever. But you're also going to experience, the highs of the highs of actually accomplishing these feats of completing these games. Maybe you'll get that 5% crit to save your dancer from like a wyvern or something, that would have killed them or whatever, You'll hit that, 40% that you just really need to kill that promoted unit so that your lord doesn't die. Whatever. And these kind of moments, they just don't matter as much if you can just reset the game. If it's a formality that you're going to complete the game. So these are the kind of moments, that I, as a person that loves Iron Mans, like, live for when I play the game. And if this sounds appealing to you, then I would highly recommend trying Iron Mans. Iron Mans can be an extremely brutal way to play Fire Emblem, but they can also be an amazing way to experience the franchise that you love in a whole new way, and they were most certainly that for me. I never thought that I would enjoy playing Fire Emblem in this way. It seemed just so much more easy and fun to use save states and just train every unit to the strongest that could possibly be. At least that's what I thought. But now, after completing many runs and having many, many more failures, Iron Mans are by far my favorite way to experience Fire Emblem, and I really can't imagine playing the games without it. I'll also just mention here, really quick, that not all games are particularly great for Iron Mans. I've done Iron Mans of basically Thracia through Shadow Dragon. I know Awakening and on, not all of those are spectacular for Iron Mans, so maybe just kind of play those by ear. I'm not really sure. I know specifically Three Houses and Engage are not particularly good for sort of the Iron Man rules, but this is also one of the reasons that I mentioned hard mode earlier. I still think that just playing on the hardest difficulty can give you a lot of that emotional and strategic sort of investment and feeling of accomplishment that I mentioned earlier. My first playthrough of Engage, for example, the newest game, I've been playing at Maddening, and I've been absolutely loving it, even though it's not an Iron Man. So you can still get a lot of that whether or not you're playing sort of in an Iron Man capacity. And I just wanted to mention, like, I know this video is probably pretty rambly. I tried to write down what I wanted to say, but really this is just a topic that I have a lot of passion for. Again, seriously, Iron Mans did sort of rekindle my love of Fire Emblem. It was always my favorite game, but now I know for sure, having Iron Man for the past couple of years, I absolutely love streaming it. I absolutely love playing it. So if you get one thing out of this video, please just try an Iron Man. Maybe you'll love it, and maybe you won't, and that's totally fine. But yeah, and then finally, I would love to hear everybody else's thoughts on Iron Man's. Have you tried it? Have you not? Do you like it? Whatever. Love to hear it down in the comments. Please, feel free to leave a comment. And yeah, just thanks everybody for watching, especially if you stuck around for this long. And I'll see you next time.